Okay, let's talk GME. The last time we left off was right over here near this bottom when I said what I thought would happen, which was a similar situation to CAT when CAT made a bottom, and at the bottom there was hourly divergences right here. So price came down to 162, hourly velocity was negative 83, price made a new low, hourly velocity did not, telling us that buyers were stepping in strong here. Price made a reversal because the daily velocity was pretty nasty to the downside. Price had to fight a bit at the hourly trigger to break above, but once it did, it magneted straight to the daily trigger before, drifting above here, waiting for the hourly trigger to cross up. The hourly trigger finally did cross up, and there was about a week or two of stagnant price action before price finally lifted, broke through the two trigger cluster of the weekly and the monthly triggers, which are the two most powerful acceleration levels, and price made a 50-point move to the upside. So price here was 189, came all the way up to 240 in the span of 2 weeks. So we also had a weekly trigger, monthly trigger airplane setup, which is when the weekly trigger comes down to the monthly trigger and lifts off, which is really bullish. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that airplanes happen with all the triggers on every time frame. Like, for example, right here, this was an airplane setup where the 1 minute trigger comes down to the 5 minute trigger, and then the 1 minute trigger lifts off and price makes a nice move to the upside. So same thing, airplane setups, you had one right here as well. The 1 minute trigger lifts up off the 5 minute trigger and price moves to the upside. So they happen everywhere. And then you have here, the 1 minute trigger came down to the hourly trigger and airplane to the upside. So a lot of times when I'm trading, I don't even use price. I just use the triggers to tell me direction. So getting back to the macro sort of things for GME, we had two things that happened this week, one very positive and one very negative. So let's jump into it. The very positive thing, we'll start off with the good news first, is that we were able to cut the negative weekly velocity in half. So the negative weekly velocity here, just remove everything else, is negative 2.9, and coming into next week, it's negative 1.6. So GME did a very good job of repairing negative weekly velocity. Now, the reason why this is important is because we can't expect price to break above these two very important acceleration levels if velocity is still negative. So for example here, when everybody was taken back or surprised by the halt, Anemoi was expecting them to be able to hold that level. And the reason for that is because if we look at the monthly velocity, it was really negative during the month of October. And so when price came up to the monthly trigger, Anemoi was telling us that they will most likely be able to defend this level and bring price back down, which they did. However, in the month of November, we could see that the monthly velocity is a lot less negative, and therefore it would be possible for price to break above the monthly trigger. But even with the possibility of price breaking above the monthly trigger, previously we had to worry about the weekly trigger acting as resistance. But now, with the velocity cut in half, the negative weekly velocity cut in half, now there is a much bigger possibility of price being able to break above these two triggers, this two trigger cluster, and exploding to the upside. Now, the problem is, one, the weekly trigger crossed below the monthly trigger, and in Anemoi, it's all about the trigger orientation. So for the best possible trigger orientation, you want to have, let's look at Oxy for a second for a good example. To be able to move in a strong, powerful uptrend, you want to have the monthly trigger at the bottom, and then the weekly trigger on top of that, and the daily trigger on top of that, and the hourly trigger on top of that. And you could see Oxy over the past 6 months has just moved in a steady bull trend because the trigger orientation was perfect. However, if we take a look at Meta, we can see that the weekly trigger crossed below the monthly trigger, and that daily trigger was below that, and the hourly trigger below that. And this is, your perfect bearish trigger orientation. So for GME just had the weekly trigger cross below the monthly trigger. Long term, that's not a good look. However, it's only barely crossed under, like by a couple of pennies. So we still have a couple of weeks to repair this. And to repair it, GME would just have to move above these two triggers, and then the weekly trigger would start turning up and coming up back above the monthly. So I think if I had to give a single forecast for this week, it's basically, we're in between two very important levels. If price would break down below the daily trigger at 26.44, it would not look good for the macro side of things, for long-term holding GME. It would imply that there might still be some lower lows that need to be taken out. But if price can just base here for another week or so, just drift sideways or even push up a drop, then GME can repair the weekly velocity a little more. To be confident that GME can break above the weekly and monthly trigger, we want to see negative velocity, not at -1.6. We want to see it at -0.0 anything. So 1 is still a strong print, right? You can see the weekly velo over here is -2, over here it's -1.6. We want to see -0.1, something like that sort. The weekly velocity print will be all the way up here, a teeny little negative velocity print. And once it's really small, like something like this was -0, this was +0.4, which is a negligible print. It's not really that important. So I think at the end of the day, we can still see something very similar to CAT. You can actually see here exactly what happened. Price came above the daily trigger, and then during this drift sideways, what happened? There was something very important that happened. As price drifted sideways, you could see that for 3 straight weeks, the weekly velocity actually was able to repair. So, price was drifting sideways here. The negative weekly velo was -206. And then over here, it was -0.5. And over here, it was -0.8. So you could see that even though price was only drifting sideways for 3 weeks, on the macro side of things, the negative weekly velocity was repairing each and every week, allowing for the possibility of price to break above the 2 trigger cluster and explode to the upside. So for a GME bull, which I am bullish on GME. I want to see sort of the same. I want to see maybe another week or two of drifting sideways and slowly inching up to keep repairing this negative weekly velo. And when the negative weekly velo is fully repaired, then I believe we'll see something explosive to the upside, a similar move to CAT made. I believe we'll see a powerful thrust through this 2 trigger cluster and a really beautiful upside powerful move. So again, that would be my forecast for the week. I think I don't think price is ready to just explode to the upside just yet, because the negative weekly velo is still -1.6. What I, as a GME bull, would like to see is another week or so of drifting sideways while repairing this negative weekly velo, setting up for an explosive move end of November or early December. If price does break above this 2 trigger cluster with this negative weekly velo for this entire week, Anemoi is telling us that we have to expect that there's a good chance that they'll be able to bring price right back down under the triggers. Once the negative weekly velo is fully repaired, then the more likelihood is that GME will be able to push to the upside and stay above these 2 triggers. If we take a look at AMC this past week, so AMC was moving really nice, and Anemoi told us exactly where to sell our options, because AMC attacked the weekly trigger and there was negative weekly velocity, and so it was rejected and brought back down. For this coming up week, it was able to cut the negative weekly velo also in half, all the way to -0.2. So over here it was -0.5, here it's -0.2. And so during this previous week, price was rejected at the weekly trigger because there was strong negative weekly velo. But for the next week, it cut it in half, and now price might be able to just pop above the 791 level and run all the way to 935. So for GME, again, just need a couple more weeks, I believe, or maybe even 1 week to repair that negative weekly velo, and that sets up a really powerful move to the upside, similar like we saw here. Once CAT was able to repair that negative weekly velocity, it was able to break through this 2 trigger cluster, exploding to the upside. And I'll give the next update when things progress.